Hello, my name's Ken Kinter. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University, and the title of this very cheery presentation is Suicide, Facts, Approaches, and Interventions. My contact information is on the bottom of this slide. So this is really meant to be an introduction to people working with suicide. The intention of it is to show the impact of suicide, the importance of having the discussions about suicide, and then at the end, some resources and places you can go that will help you maybe increase your skills in dealing with someone who may be suicidal, and other places to go to so that you have some backup, because a couple of the important takeaways of this is we do need to talk about it. Suicide is a growing problem in this country. We do need to talk about it, but you shouldn't be out there yourself making the decisions about what to do about someone who may be suicidal. So that's the premise of the whole thing. So we're going to talk with some of the statistics that we see. And as you can see, it's pretty serious. Suicide went into the top 10 in the United States causes of death over the course of the last 10 years, and it has been increasing since then. Interestingly enough, New Jersey and also New York are at the very low end of the scale. Other states like Alaska and Montana and New Mexico have a suicide rate that's about 3 times what some of these northeastern states are. That adds up to a suicide every 11 minutes, less than 11 minutes in the United States, and over 48,000 a year. And that number is continuing to grow. Actually, the number from 2017 to 2018 represents a 2% increase. Something that's been pretty typical through time, men complete suicide more, women attempt more. Men tend to utilize different methods than women do. Men are much quicker to use firearms or to attempt hanging. Women have been more used to taking overdoses. However, that does appear to be changing. The differences between gender in method of suicide, that gap is closing. White people attempt suicide and complete suicide more often than non-whites. The range of highest completion is 55 to 64 years old, not the age of highest attempts, that's more teenage. People that are divorced, widowed, and single tend to commit suicide more often than married people. And in terms of an interpersonal and financial cost, each suicide costs an estimated $1 million, directly impacts 10 people, including 6 survivors. So if you look at it by age bracket here, you see that it's a very high cause of suicide is a very high leading cause of death for people from between 10 to 54. In fact, it's the second leading cause of death between 15 and 34. Number 1 is accidents. Now, that at the bottom there, we mentioned that people from 55 to 64 have the highest completion rate of any age bracket. However, since there are so many other causes of death that become more common during that time, that's why it's ranked 8th. So there's a part where that statistic tells you 2 different things at the same time. So as you mentioned, it's been climbing up. And some of the older statistics here, you could have 3-4% of the population seriously considering suicide in a given year. We have 1 attempt every 31 seconds and 1 completion out of every 25 attempts. There are certain things that put people at higher risk for suicide. Some of them are psychiatric diagnoses. Being a teenager makes someone very high risk, and also the LGBTIQ plus community also at significantly higher risk, 2.65 to 4 times higher risk for suicide. So just to bring some old statistics into this, these are the causes of death for 2014, and we'll be making them more recent in a minute. Just the part that you can't see because of my little window here, the big blue section is heart disease, heart attacks, and the big red section underneath is cancer. So these 2 represent more than half of the listed deaths. And then you can see some of these other factors that come in as well: respiratory disease, unintentional injuries and accidents, cerebrovascular means stroke, Alzheimer's, diabetes, influenza, pneumonia, nephritis, and then finally cracking the top 10 has been suicide. So you can see that cancer and heart attacks represent a disproportionately large number, but you do have these other things. And of course, suicide has made the top 10. And as we'll see, since 2014, it's only closed the gap. Another point I would bring up is how many of those unintentional accidents or even overdoses were actually suicide attempts. We just don't have the evidence. There wasn't a note or there wasn't anything clear. So if anything, I think the suicide rate is underreported. So just to compare 2017 to those 2014 statistics that we just showed, just a couple pieces. All of these sort of stayed in the same order with the exception of accidents and chronic lower respiratory diseases. 3 and 4 sort of inverted. It wasn't that people are surviving the lower respiratory diseases, there were just many more accidents. And as you can see, the intentional self-harm or suicide jumped about 4,500 during that time, during those 3 years, and continues to rise now, as we already talked about, 48,000. So it's foreseeable that suicide can move farther up into the top 10 in upcoming years. And at the time of this recording, we're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. And one thing that'll be interesting to see in 2020 is what direction the suicide rates go from there with a lot of the additional stressors that it puts on. So suicide moved out car accidents. That's how it got into the top 10. The suicide rate has been steadily increasing after years of decline. It's been steadily increasing. And in some, it's escalated to the point where it's almost at the rate where it was during the Great Depression. In fact, in some of those leading states that I mentioned before, New Mexico, Montana, and Alaska, it is at or higher than the suicide rates during the Great Depression. It's interesting that the states that seem to have the highest rates tend to be more rural, maybe have less access to services, far less stringent mental health systems. I know in New Jersey, we are incredibly invasive. If someone makes a suicide threat on social media, usually the police are knocking at their door and that person's in an emergency room in a couple hours. Very invasive, but it helps keep the suicide rate down. I'm imagining New York is actually very similar. So the largest increases in suicide were men in their 50s and women in their early 60s. A lot of them were baby boomers. They have medical problems now. They may have some financial problems now. They're retiring. They may be getting disconnected from things, their families. They may be downsizing and moving to a new place. They have access to all sorts of great medications that have a high lethality. We also have a chronic situation with suicide of veterans and active duty military. That's been climbing quite a bit as well. So that's enough of the statistics. Getting down to the individual level now, I know that a lot of people have a lot of concern about talking about suicide with people. It's an unpleasant subject, and there's still vestiges of that old belief that if you say it to somebody, that you'll make them think about it. And nothing could be further from the truth. If the person is thinking about it, they've been thinking about it. So it's worth bringing it up, and it's worth bringing it up directly, and we'll reinforce that as we go. The point here is that not all discussion about suicide is at the same level. And this slide sort of works from the lowest lethality to higher as we go, with a few other pieces in there. So at the lowest end of the scale, we have death wishes. It's not uncommon for someone to lose someone close to them, or maybe a child loses someone close to them. And then they say, well, I want to be with grandma. I want to be with grandpa. They want to be dead, or more specifically, they want to be with someone who's dead. This is an important distinction. It isn't really being suicidal in the purest sense, but it does bear watching. Very often people who have these death wishes aren't even thinking about the permanence of death. They're just missing something. It's their effort to try to hang on. Hopelessness, and you'll also hear something called anhedonia, and that is lack of pleasure in pleasurable activities, are signs that someone is becoming increasingly suicidal. Then we have the suicidal thoughts. Now, these thoughts can be fleeting, just a quick passing thought of someone, or think I'd be better off if I were dead, or something along those lines. Ideations are different from thoughts. Ideations is where these thoughts are starting to coalesce into some sort of plan of action. And then here we have the plan, and this is where we start to get concerned. If someone thinks about how they would do it, or when they would do it, or if they started thinking about the preparations, putting their affairs in order, and you've probably heard about people giving away valuable objects, closing out pieces of business for them, things like that, setting the stage. Intent means that the person is doing a behavior that they really feel is going to kill them. So that is the desire. That was the plan. It's not taking a couple pills and then calling 911 as a call for help, or making a threat so that someone pays attention. This is a deliberate act, and that is the purpose of that. Another thing that you want to know about is access. Does someone have access to the means that they're talking about, or is it something that's far away? If there's a loaded weapon in the house, that's a whole other level of access than, oh, well, I can go get a gun. You also want to look at the history. Has someone in there, someone close to them, whether it's family or friends, someone in their peer group has completed suicide. There are all these contagions of suicide. Once there's one, there's many others. There was a pretty famous one in Manasquan, New Jersey, some years back. The other one you want to look for in here is, does someone that person look up to, have they died, or did they commit suicide? I know when Kurt Cobain killed himself, I believe it was 1994, we were getting lots and lots and lots of kids in the door who were big fans of his music, who were, coming in and, they were really taking it hard. And I know at the hospital where I worked, the suicide of Robin Williams was also very impactful. People loved his movies and they felt like they had a connection to him, and the fact that he took his own life hit them particularly hard. Other pieces that you want to look at are impulsivity during versus planning. Are you dealing with someone who's very impulsive and makes a lot of rash, quick decisions? And we may be talking about teenagers again here. Or is it someone who's very methodical, who thinks about what they're going to do? It's important to know how that person is in other areas of their life and to see whether that carries over into aspects of suicide. Is someone likely to do something very rash, say a boyfriend-girlfriend breakup, and then they're going to do something right away after that? Or is it someone who's going to plan something? So without getting too into the details of this, it's hard to ascertain how suicidal someone is. First of all, they may not know how close they are to it. And then the other part is they may be afraid to tell you, or they may not trust you enough to tell you. So basically what this means is their intent is usually more than you think it is. Don't assume that they've told you everything or how close they really are to suicide, because there may be something else they're not telling you, because that's the hardest part to tell you. If they've already been hoarding up their medications for 30 days, that may be the thing they leave out. They may say, sometimes I've had thoughts about taking pills, but they may not tell you they got 30 days worth sitting on the nightstand ready to go. They may be afraid that you'll intervene. So this is really this is where we talk about the withheld intent, the part they don't tell you. And this is why it's so important to respond, because odds are the lethality is higher than you think it is. So another thing, when you're assessing somebody for suicide, you want to find out a couple different dimensions about what's going on. There's what's been happening, what's going on right now, what set this off right in the moment, right in the immediate time. What's been going on the last couple days? How long have you been thinking about this? Is this a developing situation? How about the last 6 to 8 weeks? How have things generally been going for you? Is this a bad patch that you just can't seem to get out of? And then the history of attempts. One thing that's really interesting is to see a thread between times that someone has attempted. How have these things gone similar? Legal problems, problems with custody of children, addiction issues, relationships. Is there a theme? Very often there is. There's a theme in someone's life when they're suicidal. And that's a good thing to know if you're working with somebody. So a couple other points about this. First of all, suicide and self-mutilation are not the same thing. Self-mutilation, cutting yourself, burning yourself, tends to be more of an expression of expressing emotional pain through physical pain. Suicide is not the intent. So it's a mistake to see if someone has a ton of superficial cuts on their arms. You don't necessarily have to ask them about suicide. You want to ask them why they're doing what they're doing, although it's never a bad idea to ask. Because one of the other things about self-mutilation is it starts off small and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I've seen people do some significant damage to themselves, potentially lethal damage to themselves, even though suicide was not their intent. Discussing suicide openly and seriously, as we said before, talk about it. We have to talk about it. It's common, it's lethal, it's all over the place. We can't be afraid to bring it up. We have to have the strength to bring it up, and hopefully be the window by which someone can, see out of it and communicate with you. This next point may be one of the most important in this whole presentation. Don't keep the secret. If someone says that they'll tell you something, but you have to keep it secret, and that secret is that they're suicidal, they have to know, first of all, in advance, that that's not a secret you can keep. But even if they spring it on you, I can't keep that secret. My favorite expression about that is, I would rather you be alive and angry at me than dead. That's my go-to line. Feel free to steal it. I probably stole it from somebody anyway. Now, depending on your job, you may have a legal obligation to respond. But even if you don't, you don't want that on your conscience. Believe me, I've worked with people who've ended up completing suicide afterwards. And as somebody who works in the helping professions, look in the mirror for a while at yourself and you go, what could I have done? And if you did everything you could do, you feel a little better. If there's that thing, I could have done it. You don't want that. So hopefully you have a supervisor or you have someone around that you can bring this to. Bring it to them. You will always be on the good side of breaking confidentiality if suicide is the reason why. The other piece is when you're speaking to someone using direct language. I've heard a lot of clinicians, and I was guilty of this too, using very tentative language. Are you sort of kind of having thoughts about hurting yourself? That's not what you want to do. Hurting yourself can be self-mutilation. Hurting yourself can mean a lot of other things. It's very wishy-washy language. Are you thinking about killing yourself? There, just say it and get that person's answer. And they'll have a verbal answer and they'll have a non-verbal answer. And both of those are very important. But don't be afraid to bring it directly. So as far as crisis prevention and intervention goes, the best intervention is prevention. So that means that when that person's suicidal, that should not be the first time you're talking about suicide with that person. You can ask, when you're in the information gathering stage at the beginning of a relationship, ask, have you been suicidal before? What's the furthest you've gone? What led to that? Get the narrative. Don't be, and again, you're sending out the message right now, I'm not bothered by this. I'm fine asking you about this. We're talking about this just like we're talking about the weather. It may become very important to know those things down the road. And it should be as common a part of the conversation as the goals you're working on with that person. I'm a big believer in, you plan for the best, expect the worst. Cover both sides of things. So you're working on goals and you're trying to get that person and help them get to where they need to go, but you're also prepared if the bottom drops out, and you're with them either way. That's a very important message. So I wanted to put some resources down here for you. I'm going to take a minute to explain this. This isn't just a typical resource slide. The American Association of Suicidology is where I got a lot of the suicide statistics you saw in the first part of this. And they have a great list of resources at the link that's right here. If you are interested in, if you're saying that you want to have a more organized way of asking people about suicide, if this is a routine part of what you do, I would look no further than the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. They have free trainings. They are, I don't know if they're still operating that way, but they trained us for free. And all they wanted was the data back so that they can continue to improve the tools. And they have a series of them. They have them at intake, when there's a crisis going on. So it's very sophisticated and very helpful. There's also trainings going on, and this is a big federal push as well, for something called mental health first aid. And the website is there. They have people that they pay to train people in mental health first aid. And it's a very good way to get people who maybe haven't worked in the mental health system for a long time familiar with how to talk about this stuff. And there's also a youth version of that as well, that they're training people in schools, because of course suicide is becoming a growing problem in the schools. I'm not sure where you are, so I can't give you resources that are specific to where you're from. Feel free to reach out to me about this if you have any questions, but we did throw a couple national resources down there, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and also a crisis text line for those of you who are more likely to make a text than pick up the phone. So here's where we got the information from. I'd like to thank Annette Bax and Fran Ulrich from the original version of this slide deck, and these other resources that are all here, some of which we talked about. Feel free to check out our other videos that are in this series, and I look forward to talking to you again. Take care.